Hey, just give me 1 second. Can you see this? Can you see that? Is it in focus? That's the Crusader. It's the class that I designed for the expansion for Diablo 3. Well, I mean, not that. That's a statue. But this. And it may well be some of the best design work I've done in my career. But today, let's talk about the design of the class, how we built it, sort of take you through that whole process. I'm also going to share with you what might be the biggest mistake I've made in my career. Let's get into it. So it all started as we were wrapping up Diablo 3. The game director asked me to own the design of the Crusader, and of course I said yes. I mean, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but of course I said yes. Oh, side note here, someone in the community asked, why we didn't do the Necromancer first. It really comes down to what types of play have already been well covered. When you add a class to a game, you want to ensure that you're able to carve out some amount of unique playstyle. And the Necro playstyle of minion summoning was already being really well owned by the Witch Doctor. On top of that, having the Necro and Malthael, which thematically they're really similar, it steps on each other too much. They both have the style of death, color schemes of darkish green. It would have been too much similarity. The Crusader was very anti-themed to the rest of that narrative. Getting back to the Crusader, we started by defining the core pillars. For me, big systems like this always start with these pillars. They are the foundations which allow you to make all other design or art decisions. We had all this amazing imagery that Vic had done of this guy with this massive shield, but in Diablo, shields sucked. They were just poor stat sticks that took up valuable damage slot. I knew that the inclination would always be to try and find a way to remove the shield from his kit, which I really didn't want. I wanted us to suffer through the pain and constraint of having to design around the shield and just find a way to make it work, rather than the easy way out of, well, he just doesn't wear it all the time. So his first pillar was the shield is his weapon. This way we were forced to design with it in mind. If you play any kind of MMO, you'll know that a tank is a heavily armored class that normally takes all of the damage so that the other classes can do damage. Well, we wanted the Crusader to feel the same way, but with a bit of a twist. This led to his second pillar of she is a tank. In Diablo, it's important that all classes can keep up damage-wise, and it's not quite as necessary to have clearly distinct class roles like an MMO. We wanted to get the feeling that he was able to mitigate or support other classes while still doing a lot of damage. Candidly, I think this is the weakest of the three pillars. If I could go back, I'd probably make this more around him being a mid-range tank or something like that. Unlike many of the other classes in Diablo, we wanted to ensure that the Crusader felt like she came from a long line of Crusaders, and that he had brothers and sisters they could call upon for support. This resulted in the third pillar of comes from an order. This shows through in abilities like Barrage, where she calls in artillery from afar, or Phalanx. These were not decided unilaterally, of course. As I put them together, there was a lot of sharing and socializing to get feedback on them and refine them down. With those in place, we moved on to brainstorming and building out the first skills. We needed about 25 skills, each with 5 runes. Some of these were fairly obvious, like Blessed Hammer. We knew we were going to bring that forward, but there were a lot of unknowns there, lots of opportunity. Now that we had these core pillars and some key artwork, we brought the rest of the team into a series of brainstorming sessions where they asked questions and we just allowed them to go crazy with their ideas. It was quite a process. I get more into brainstorming in a detail in this video where I talk about coming up with ideas. Safe to say, after the brainstorming, we had more than enough ideas than what we needed, so we moved on to building out some of the core skills. The first skills I think we worked on were Shield Bash, Flail, and Blessed Shield. We also tackled some of the laws very early, if I remember correctly. It was a long time ago. We started with Shield Bash because going back to his pillars, the shield is the weapon, so we wanted to ensure that she had some sort of primary generator ability that was heavily reliant on his shield. It took a lot of time to iterate, and much of that comes from the animation. We also went with the flail ability because that just kind of felt natural. We knew that the flail was going to be, it was part of the core artwork, the flail was going to be her signature weapon, so we wanted to tie a skill directly to it. This also was really nice because the natural action of a flail sweeping attack, which gave him a really good AoE as a primary ability, and Diablo 3 loves AoE abilities. Blessed Shield is, of course, leaning into the shield part of being his primary weapon. We decided to give him the Captain America shield that bounced around. We actually called it that. This was also probably the number one idea that came up through the brainstorm, so it was kind of a no-brainer to make sure that it was one of the first abilities that we put in. These first abilities, they define the core of the class. You want them to reflect the pillars and also speak to the kind of playstyle you're going for. By choosing Shield Bash, a really short but powerful melee ability, Flail, this AoE melee ability, and Blessed Shield, this powerful mid-ranged ability, it nicely packaged up this sense of a class that's really strong in melee, but has good mid-range capabilities as well. The laws are a really interesting skill category. We did those fairly early on as well, if I recall. We wanted them to have buffs, as that was part of the paladin element that we were using as inspiration, but there was the general concern about making them a buffadin again. The buffadin was effectively a situation where the paladin was only brought into groups for the buffs that she provided to the teammates. For a very limited set of players, this is fun, but in general, the trade-off of not really doing any damage, it just isn't appealing to players. Buffs had the added challenge of the restriction around the way that active abilities work in Diablo. Any time that you decided that you wanted to make an ability something you could cast, you had to move that ability to one of your ability slots. These slots are all competing with each other, as there's only 5 of them. If the ability you are putting on one of those slots is purely passive, not only does it take away an opportunity for an interesting button to press, it also makes the player have to choose between that and another active ability, like, say, Blessed Hammer. An option, of course, is for them to have the buffs on the passive tree, but in general we avoided having passives that have the same power budget as an active ability, and we tried to avoid passive abilities having group benefits. They were a very individual thing. So the solution here was to combine the passive bonus, which is a group buff that everyone received whenever the law was in an active slot, with an on-activation ability, which provided the player themselves with a temporary extra boost of that same buff, or something similar. It turned out really well. It was a little complicated in some ways, and there was a bit of pushback about overloading a single ability with dual functions, but I had to believe that our players were smart enough to be able to handle that. With the laws, players still feel like they can be a buff class, and you know you're bringing a benefit to your group, but then once in a while you get to push a button that makes yourself feel better. We also were trying to figure out how the resource model was going to work for the Crusader. Honestly, it was pretty easy, as we already had some really clear examples of what worked and what didn't with the existing classes. I knew I didn't want something like the Barbarian's Wrath, a resource where you start combat without you need to build up that resource with the first few hits. It generally felt bad in Diablo, where combat was so fast and enemies died really quickly. Barbarians would either end up in situations where they were resource starved for most of the fight, or they would have to completely over-index on Wrath generation stats so as to kind of break the resource model rather than playing with it. The Wizard's resource was probably the best that we had, at least in my opinion. It had passive regeneration, so you generally started combat with a full pool, but you could spend it pretty quickly. Then you had some free primary abilities that you could have cast while waiting for it to regen. So I decided to mimic most of that and integrate the same model on the Crusader, with his primary abilities acting as generators. He has this passive regen, so he always enters a fight with some amount of resource. Between fights, he passively regenerating it, and then he can enter the next fight with that resource already built up, start the combat with a blessed shield or, one of his big spenders, and that just kicks off the fight really, really well. With that spend, he falls back on his primary generators and repeat. It has a really nice cadence to the combat. So everything was going really well, and then I made a mistake which totally messed everything up. So we had good core abilities, we had a resource working, we had some pretty basic gameplay that reflected the style of the class we were going for, and I was just really excited, so I decided, hey, let's do a team-wide playtest. It was a huge mistake. I just didn't prepare enough. I didn't put enough effort into ensuring the playtest would go smoothly. We let the team know in an email, hey, he's good to go ahead and test him, and we just let them go and playtest it on their own time. People played it, they were really confused by it. Because I didn't prepare enough for it, there wasn't a clear understanding of what abilities we wanted them to test, what abilities were even functional or not. The Crusader at this stage, it was super early development. There were some abilities that, were really good enough to be tested and we felt reflected the promise of the class. But there were also a lot of abilities that were only half functional, some which were just placeholders, and there were a lot of gaps as well. We just kind of left them on there and asked people to play without any guidance, even though there were these broken abilities on the build. And unsurprisingly, they played it and we got a lot of really negative feedback, which totally makes sense. Getting that feedback is a real body blow. Even though we can rationalize it as, we didn't prepare well enough, it's still hard to see. It's also hard for the team making the Crusader to see that feedback. On top of that, it also reduces confidence in the team as a whole with the Crusader and with the team making the class. It sucked. But we rallied. We acknowledged the failure. I took responsibility for not preparing well enough and owned the mistake. After that, back to work. Like I said, we had a few skills that were kind of working. We had some that were core that we were pretty confident about. We had the resource model mostly nailed down. We'd also begun to figure out what his skill color scheme would look and feel like, and how it would differentiate itself from like the monks, which are really similar color. I'm not the best to talk about that though. I'll probably ask my friend Julian Love to go into that more detail one day. So we decided to cut down some of our biggest trees. Cutting down the biggest trees is a term a producer used to use. It pretty much means figure out the hardest question and cut that down first. Figure that one out first. Taking a look at the remaining skills, the most challenging ones, top of the list, was Heaven's Fury. That was a tough one. Heaven's Fury was one of those ideas that originally came from the brainstorm. Someone had pitched drawing a skill on the ground. The inspiration came from Zelda Phantom Hourglass, where you could draw with the stylus the path that the boomerang was going to take. We wanted to try doing something similar with this spell, where the player would use their mouse to draw out the path that the spell was going to take. Then the spell was cast and traveled, it kind of followed that path, killing everything as it went. It sounded really cool, and we had nothing else like it in the game, so we decided to try and make it, see what we could learn. Roger, the engineer who was helping me out at the time, actually created a really hacky and terrible way for it to work. It really only worked locally, it was laggy, performance of it was kind of terrible, but making it run well, that really wasn't the purpose. What we were trying to figure out is, does this even feel good to draw a line and then have a beam follow it? So we got the beam part working and the line worked. Once we had it working, we quickly realized it was really confusing. You weren't really sure where the line was that you were drawing it after where it was going. The worst part was the delay between drawing it and the beam coming in and following that path. Diablo's a really fast-paced game, and by the time you'd drawn the path and the beam came down and started following it, the creatures you were targeting had moved away. Also, while you were drawing the line, the Crusader had to stand still. Standing still in Diablo feels terrible, and just like other channeled abilities which require you to stay still, they don't feel good because your character is locked in place during this time. Worse still, it wasn't even like you were doing damage while you were standing still. What did feel good was seeing this massive beam come down from the sky and melt enemies. Even though you weren't directly in control of the beam, knowing that you would cast it and summoned it felt amazing. It was this finger of God helping you out, a really angry, mean finger of God. We tried to make the path work in a few different ways, but it just wasn't playing out. So we decided to just let it rest for a bit, just let the back of our brains work on the problem while we focused on something else. A few days later, Roger came to me. He called me over pretty excited. He'd been playing around with it, and what he'd done was spawn in an invisible creature, which had a really basic AI on it that made the creature move towards any nearby enemy. He then added a pulsing damage ability to the creature and put the giant beam of death on it. And it looked amazing. From the player's perspective, they quickly cast the ability and this massive beam comes down from the sky and slowly starts tracking towards enemies, burning them for you. It didn't matter that you weren't directly in control of the beam. It was enough to know that you'd cast it. That's pretty much how Heaven's Fury still works today, I think. There's this little invisible creature with a ray of God's wrath targeting it, slowly moving around, trying to stand on nearby monsters. Probably one of the last things we did was the passives, and most of them were pretty straightforward. The one that's probably the most interesting is Heavenly Strength. That's the one that allows you to wield the two-handed weapon in your main hand while carrying a shield. We always knew this was going to be a thing, especially because the shield is required. We knew that players would want to have a two-handed item, have that big, slow, clunky kind of gameplay, while also wielding the shield, because the shield is mandatory. The pillar had worked, and the shield, being his weapon, was now completely integral. It wasn't an option to not carry a Crusader shield. So how do you allow players to also carry two-handed weapons? Originally, I wanted Heavenly Strength to be far more thematic and less mathy. I don't really like abilities or passives which just feel like a numbers choice. I'm pretty strong on starting with a fantasy, even if that means sacrificing balance in favor of that fantasy. So originally, Heavenly Strength allowed you to carry the big weapon, but the trade-off for that power was movement speed. In some ways, I think it's probably still one of the best directions to go with it, but making players choose to move slower it's just too far. This is doubly so in a game like Diablo, which has a lot of moving between packs and enemies, and you want to try to stay together as a group. If you're not able to stay with your friends because you choose the two-hander, well, it's kind of terrible. Eventually, we just took the most obvious solution by just reducing the damage you dealt by 20%. It's literally the amount of damage that you get by wielding a two-handed weapon. That's what's budgeted for them. So it's wonderfully balanced, but it still doesn't feel like it matches well with that fantasy.
Not ready yet.
And then finally, there's many tuning passes. Mostly, this was fairly straightforward. Wyatt had a lot of wonderful spreadsheets that he used. Wyatt was typically the person who did all the tuning, which made a ton of sense because he understood the systems best, and honestly, he was the best at it. One thing we did with the Crusader, which we did with almost every class that we ever released at Blizzard, we always overtuned them. Every new class gets a baseline 10% or so bonus to their power budget over other classes. We want to encourage players to play them. The best way to do that is to have them do more damage. It feels really obvious when you think about it. It's almost duplicitous. But a lot of the game design really is about crafting something that makes players want to do things. So in the case of we want players to play the class, well, it's a pretty easy win. Eventually, everyone wins because in the first or second patch, there's always balancing done to the other classes. And at that moment, those other classes also receive that 10% damage bonus. One thing I'll say, just to wrap it up here, there are a lot of people who work on a feature like the Crusader. I say like I designed it and everything, but the reality is that while I did the core design, there's so many other people who put their hands into it and put the passion into it of making sure that it all comes together in this, it's really a team effort. There's no way that any individual person could do something and deliver something as complex or as highly, just amazingly high quality as the Crusader. So when you're playing it next time or looking at it, try to make sure you look at the credits. I know it's not easy, but there's a lot of people on there, all the tech, all the engineers, the concept artists, the animators, back-end engineers, just everything. Producers, they all come together to do such amazing work, and it is such a huge effort. It's a team effort. So if you enjoyed this and would like to hear some more about Diablo, I have a video just for you right here. In this one, I talk about Diablo much more broadly, comparing it to Last Epoch. For now though, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.